You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. And we're back with Habitat University, and this is the last of our little series about Aldo Leopold's 5 tools of game management, or we're going to use them as habitat management. And maybe I shouldn't say it's our last because we have a little bit of another episode where we're going to kind of see what maybe Aldo missed or wasn't available when Aldo Leopold was around. But this is the last of the 5 tools. And so this week, Adam had the duty of finding the interviewee and doing the interview. So he got the chance to talk about the gun. And Adam, who'd you talk with?
Yeah, I had a friend of ours on the show this week, Patt Dorsey. Pat's a wildlife biologist with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And before that, she was a wildlife biologist and even did some law enforcement work with the Colorado Wildlife Agency. And through those two lenses, those two positions that she's had throughout her really successful career, she's really got some neat perspectives on the role of hunting and wildlife conservation. And so we had a really nice discussion, like how does hunting connect to habitat management, not just population management, but how does it connect to habitat management? And I think her diversity of experiences and her Western perspective was kind of a new one on the podcast and also really insightful.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because it's not quite as straightforward as maybe the other tools in the habitat management sense. So you kind of got to connect the dots to see how it's a habitat management tool. And I think, you and Pat probably did that during the discussion, right?
Yeah, she did. She did a really nice job of connecting the dots for us because you're right. Yeah, we think of hunting often as like you said, like a population management mechanism, but she did connect those dots. She talked a lot about how, managing game populations through harvest is really important in like eastern forests or where deer may be overabundant or in some western range scenarios. And then we also talked about like sort of an indirect but really substantial impact that hunting and hunters have on wildlife habitat in North America, and that is just through their advocacy, their voice, through nonprofits or their support for policies that fund wildlife conservation, wildlife habitat conservation, or actually putting boots on the ground and actually doing wildlife habitat work like we see with her organization, the National Wild Turkey Federation, that's literally focuses on hunting and habitat. Like that's their mission. So it was a really neat discussion. You're right. It did take us a little while to get to habitat management, but it's there and it's a really neat and important connection, I think, for people to understand.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to listen to the episode, and I think the listeners will get a lot out of it. And so we're going to cut to Adam and Pat talking, but before we do that, I want to let you know that we still have our feedback survey that's going to be linked in the podcast description, and that's really helpful to us to kind of get an idea of what topics people are looking to hear about, maybe guests that people have that they're interested in hearing from, but also helps us kind of identify how useful is the information that we're providing to you, so we can kind of retool and re-gear the podcast to kind of fit the needs of our listeners. So if you don't mind filling that out, it takes probably less than 5 minutes. We would really appreciate it. With that, don't forget to like and subscribe and maybe add a comment on our podcast. And with that, here's Pat and Adam.
Well, Pat, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
So we are really excited to have you on to talk about the gun because we think you're uniquely positioned to talk about the role of hunting and hunters and wildlife habitat management from a couple of different perspectives from the diverse career that you've led. So what I wanted to start with was just kind of tell us who you are and who you work for now and a little bit about how you got to where you are now to get us thinking about how it is that you've worked with hunters and hunting and habitat management through your career.
Yeah, so now I work for the National Wild Turkey Federation, and I'm actually the Director of Conservation Operations for the West region. So I have the Rocky Mountain states and everything west of there. Prior to that, I was a wildlife manager at a state wildlife agency for about 28 years. And then prior to that, I like to joke and say I was my father's only son because I got interested and all I wanted to do was go hunting with my dad and my grandpa from the time I was, 7 years old or something. And I ultimately passed my hunter safety class when I was like 9 and have been a hunter ever since. So I'm excited that you asked me to do this part. I hope I can do it justice.
Oh, that's awesome. So that the 9-year-old Patt Dorsey, were you hunting in Colorado? Is that where that was, or?
Yeah, and now I live in the mountains of Colorado, but at that time, my grandparents owned a farm on the eastern plains of Colorado, and so I grew up pheasant hunting and duck and goose hunting for the most part. And I that part of it is really dear to me, even though now I mostly hunt big game, but it's like I still miss that small game hunting and how I started as a kid.
Yeah, that's cool. So you mentioned you worked for a wildlife agency. I was curious about like a lot of work that you did with the wildlife agency presumably had to do with interacting with hunters and managing harvest and the way that people interact with wildlife. Could you share a little bit about what you did in that role and what how that interfaced both with habitat management and with hunting management?
Yeah, so in Colorado, wildlife managers are really kind of multi-purpose, and we do a lot of different things. And so part of what I did was law enforcement, where sometimes you get to see the best side of hunters, and you also get to see the worst side of hunters, right? Or hunters, not so much hunting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I also did biological surveys. So we would, fly and do inventories and do classification on animals, check the condition of the habitat, that kind of thing. And for a number of years, I also was the hunter ed administrator for the state. And so I got to put all of those pieces together to help hunters understand how they related to wildlife and habitat management. And at the same time, I got to take the hunting piece back to the wildlife management side of the organization. So I think the two are really strongly linked. And sometimes I don't know if we as professionals pay enough attention to that, right? But we need to work more closely together. I think particularly as times get tougher, we need more collaboration, not less. We need more collaboration with hunters and private landowners, with universities, all of that kind of stuff. So just something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with that. We have to kind of come to understand one another and understand how, we share a lot more common interests than we do not. So yeah, that's a topic I definitely want to explore some more today about what opportunities you see for those sorts of collaborations. I'm curious on another part of your job, the part that you've now assumed with NWTF. Could you tell us a little bit about what NWTF is and how it's structured and for folks that may not be familiar with the organization?
Well, it was really interesting for me leaving a state wildlife agency and coming to work for a nonprofit. But the mission of the National Wild Turkey Federation is to save or to conserve the wild turkey and our hunting heritage. And so it's really a double prong thing. And it's good to work for an organization that understands the relationship between hunting and conservation. And so we spend the majority of our money that we put to the ground, which is about 89 cents out of every dollar goes to the ground, doing habitat work. Because, it's almost I don't want to say a field of dreams kind of thing, but it's like if you have good habitat, the wildlife will come. And so to put our effort there is a good use of our members' dollars, of the other people that contribute financially to the organization and want to see better wildlife habitat, cleaner water, all of that kind of stuff to go to the ground.
Is that consistent with like the vision for NWTF since its inception, or is that something that NWTF kind of came to more recently? I'm kind of curious on the history of how it is that NWTF became so focused on habitat restoration and those connections.
Yeah, and we've always, I think, very early on. So we were formed in like 1983. And in 1983, at that particular point in time, the North American wild turkey was not doing well necessarily in all states. And so we were helping state wildlife agencies that wanted to establish wild turkeys with trap and transplant locations. So you take them from a place where they had good turkey populations in good turkey habitat and move them to another state where they had good turkey habitat but needed turkeys. But once the turkey had been established pretty much across the United States back into historical habitat, we turned our focus to habitat restoration. And in fact, not quite 10 years ago, we started the Save the Habitat, Save the Hunt initiative. And, that was a 10-year initiative. We tried, our goal was to conserve 4 million acres of habitat. And we achieved that within 8 years. So it's pretty neat to see that focus change. Once the wildlife populations are there, then you can concentrate on other stuff and just continue to make it better and make sure that it's there for the future.
That's awesome. I am really appreciative of these types of organizations that are doing this kind of work. And it's, of course, a place where we find among professional wildlife biologists a lot of expertise like yours and many of your colleagues that benefits everybody that's interested in wildlife conservation. So what you just described is, taking me back to my introduction to wildlife and fishery sciences classes where we talk about these important eras in wildlife conservation. And of course, that one, there was a period where we did a lot of translocation and reintroduction. And today we do a lot of this ecosystem management. And so before that translocation and reintroduction period, we have the sort of ugly history of American wildlife management and conservation. And the Aldo Leopold quote that we're using to structure these episodes in this episode, the reason we called you, is the central thesis of game management is this: game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it: the axe, the plow, the cow, the fire, and the gun. And so I think a good place to start in this discussion today is tell us about what it looked like in the 1930s and before that Aldo Leopold was talking about when he said that the gun had, quote, heretofore destroyed game populations or game management.
Yeah, and if you're okay with that, I'd like to go back even a little prior to 1930, right?
Yeah.
To Aldo's era, because what happened at the turn of the century was the market hunting. And so market hunting was basically this indiscriminate killing, I'll call it. And it was in part, part of manifest destiny in a way, right? Like we're gonna harvest game animals. That's going to feed the people that are living in towns. It's going to feed the miners that are settling the West. It's going to feed the people that are building the railroad as it went across country. And at the same time that we had this indiscriminate killing of wildlife for markets, it got even crazier, right? We were killing beautiful water birds for ladies' hats, and we were killing I don't know. I have a brain lapse, Adam.
I just read this week that a city in Iowa, Muscatine, Iowa, was the button capital of the world, and it was the exact same story for freshwater mussels, where they were indiscriminately killing freshwater mussels to make buttons out of them in sort of an unsustainable way. So that was kind of interesting. I'm familiar with those stories you're sharing, but yeah, add the mussel to the list. Many freshwater mussels were unsustainably
Yeah.
exploited.
I saw a picture of a lady's hat that had 16 Carolina parakeets in it or something like that. And it's hard to believe that that was ever a fashion,
Yeah.
but it was. And at the same time that we were doing the destruction of wildlife itself to feed our country or for fashion or for what other purposes, we were at the same time we were destroying habitats, right? We were cutting down hardwood trees so that were food crops and all of that kind of stuff. And so one of the very first things that we did is we stopped hunting shortly after the turn of the century. I know some of the first wildlife laws in Colorado just basically ended hunting altogether. Um, and what they figured out after a while is game populations sort of recovered, but about 1930, it still hadn't completely come around, right? It hadn't fixed it, and that's when you enter, the thinkers like Aldo Leopold, um, and the other organizations, the Soil Conservation Service at the time, right, that started focusing on habitat and restoring the landscape. And then from there, I think the gun and the habitat work went together really well. And in fact, if you're up for it, I'd like to read to you another Leopold quote that I think explores how important hunting and the gun could be in restoring habitats.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay, so you probably know the one I'm going to read. It's from the Fierce Green Fire. And it was as Aldo was watching the wolf die. But what he said is, I now suspect that just as a deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer. And perhaps with better cause. For why a buck pulled down by wolves can be replaced in 2 or 3 years, a range pulled down by too many deer may fail of replacement in as many decades. So I think the hunter's role in population management, and we're certainly entering an area now where we've restored almost everything. We need to think about actively managing it for the habitat that we have available. The hunter's role is still an important one.
That's a wonderful quote. I think that's just a perfect portrayal of the idea of what he was kind of talking about when he said that it can be game management, it can be restored by the creative use of the gun, recognizing that it wasn't necessarily the gun that got us into the predicament that we were in. It was the absence of the judicial application of the gun, or judicious application of the gun through regulations and population monitoring. So that's really cool. That's a neat example and a perfect quote to transition into what it looks like to manage wildlife habitat through managing wildlife populations along with hunters. So what species comes to mind for you when we think of managing wildlife habitat through hunting?
Well, there's a couple of them. Obviously there are crazy things like wild boar in Spain, and there's the snow geese in the Arctic. But since I started it off with an Aldo Leopold quote that talked about deer, I think white-tailed deer in the eastern United States are, probably the best example I can come up with. And I was reading a article the other day, and the Nature Conservancy actually said that white-tailed deer are having as big of an impact or a greater impact on eastern forests than climate change is. And so that's pretty significant when you think about it. And so not only are they impacting forests, but they're impacting songbirds, they're impacting all that other stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They definitely have substantial impacts on those communities, and of course that is driven primarily by the absence of any sort of top-down pressure on their populations. We find this in urban areas, especially where there is no hunting and there are relatively abundant resources like natural areas set aside, or even I have a pair of whitetail fawns visiting a bird feeder in my urban backyard, and these resources can be really abundant, and we find that they can really suppress populations of plants that have ripple impacts on wildlife. So I guess I'm curious on your thinking. There are alternative ways of managing abundance of animals. Do you like we hear at least of things like contraception or contracted control? What's the advantage of using hunters, or what's your logic or argument on using hunting as a way to control wildlife populations and help eastern deciduous forests in this case?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things. One is, and it may not be a perfect solution anywhere, but I think it's a solution that we ought to consider as much as possible for a couple of reasons. And one is obviously the cost of managing these populations with hunters. If you think about the cost of hiring a sharpshooter to go out into an area to harvest deer, you're actually paying that person a lot of money to do that. In the case of hunters, they will pay you to do that, right? The other thing is I think about hunters is like they're not this thing out there. They're not this black coat wearing ninja that hides in the corner. These are people that are friends, right? They're members of your community. It could be the guy that's the president of the bank, the guy that delivers your mail, the neighbor next door to you, all of those kind of things. And so they oftentimes are familiar with the area. And what I find about hunters is they have a real deep sense of place. And so they really appreciate the landscape that they're in, and want to see it managed appropriately. And they also, I mean, as a member of the community, you want to have the best things for your community too. So as part of a community plan, and a lot of what I'm seeing now in these urban areas in particular is a desire to do community planning so that hunters are built in to that aspect with the community, and they know what to expect from each other.
Yeah, I like that thinking, and your point about hunters knowing the land and being really connected to the land, I think, is another reason that we see value in hunting and having hunters associated with wildlife habitat managers. Put simply, hunting takes habitat. Like, it takes a good amount of habitat. And you said, was it 8 million or 4 million acres? 4 million acres of habitat in 8 years with NWTF. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. That although certainly other user groups are engaged in advocating for habitat and ecosystem management and things like that, it seems to me that there is something unique about spending hours on end alone in a tree stand thinking about how the ecosystem works that makes hunters pretty strong advocates for some of this habitat management on private and public lands.
I agree with you too. And the other thing I think that's unique from a hunter's perspective is, and I look at friends of mine that are, maybe their primary activity is they are mountain bikers or they're hikers, and they hike that trail and then they want to go hike a different one. And for me as a hunter, I want to be back in the same tree every year on the same day, looking at the same landscape. And I can see how it's changed. I can see how, the drought has affected it, or how, we move the cattle off of that landscape and put them in a different pasture, and what that's done. And maybe it's time to get the cattle back in there. There are all those kind of things. And I don't think people that just pass through an ecosystem have the same appreciation as maybe when you sit in it for a while.
Yeah, I really like that. I just actually made the point in my class today that although I am a consumptive user as a hunter, I spend the vast majority of my time engaged in far from consumptive things while I'm hunting. And in fact, that was the entire outcome of my bow season. It was an entirely non-consumptive bow season. And I think having, in the case of, the United States, somewhere around 11 million people in the woods doing things like that has resulted in some good for wildlife habitat. So another way that I wanted to, or kind of another direction that I wanted to take the discussion was to talk about other organizations or other impacts on habitat management that hunters have sort of through their collective actions. So what other sort of examples come to mind when we think of the collective impacts of hunting and hunters on wildlife habitat in the United States?
Yeah, so I can think of three, and I'm going to put it in terms of direct expenditures on hunting licenses and waterfowl stamps and that kind of thing. The other would be just sort of their indirect economic impacts and how that might turn around in a community. And then I think, we've talked about the National Wild Turkey Federation, the NWTF, but I think the contributions made to habitat conservation by other organizations, including the NWTF, have been huge. Um, and so as an example, Ducks Unlimited, since 1937, which came about the same time as the Pittman-Robertson Act and some of these other things that we were seeing, 14 million acres of critical wetland habitat. And so if you think about that in terms of, what an acre of coastal habitat in Louisiana, as an example, is worth in terms of flood control, in terms of biological diversity, in terms of all those kind of things, and what a hunter's contribution might be at about $1,900 an acre for just the storm management functions. It's pretty incredible, right? The fact that that Ducks Unlimited has spent, however much money it has been restoring those acres, the benefit to society has been huge, and the benefit to wildlife habitat has been huge. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is another example, and there's a lot of these groups. People call them critter groups, and I'm not going to cover them all. I don't want to feel bad for leaving somebody out, but the Elk Foundation's been around since about 1984, and by their estimate, they've do about 1 square mile of elk habitat every day. So for a total of 8 million acres. And when I think about the Elk Foundation in particular, think about elk habitat and what that's done to protect grizzly bears and gray wolves and all of these, carnivores, right? That are these huge carnivores that are in the process of restoration in this country. And then pheasants forever, 19 million acres of habitat conserved. So, if you add up the NWTF, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and Pheasants Forever, I'm going to need a calculator, Adam. That's a lot of habitat.
Yeah, it is a lot of habitat. That's really cool. So, you mentioned just in passing. Well, we got a couple of things to break down there. But one thing you said, you mentioned PR Act, but I don't think we've quite yet talked about that. And you said it's 1937. The quote we're working from, 1933. It's this time where there was a lot of change and recognition of the importance to band together. And out of that comes things like Ducks Unlimited and eventually NWTF and Pheasants Forever and the like. So tell us more about PR. You said that word, but I don't think we've yet defined it. Tell us about that and what impact that's had on wildlife habitat in the United States.
Yeah, and so PR stands for Pittman-Robertson, which was the last names of the two legislators that sponsored that legislation. It's also known as the Wildlife Restoration Act. And that's probably the more technical name for it, although we often hear it called PR. But in my personal opinion, that's the most ingenious piece of legislation anywhere in the world, for a couple of reasons. One of the things it did is it recognized the importance of wildlife habitat. And I think I had mentioned, early on, we had shut down market hunting. So we had done our job when it came to law enforcement. What needed to be done was to focus on the landscape. And Pittman-Robertson said, we're going to spend money educating wildlife professionals. We're going to spend money doing research. We're going to spend money improving habitat on the ground. And we're going to try to turn wildlife restoration around in this country. And it did. And that's ingenious enough, right? But what's even more ingenious is that hunting license dollars go to the state wildlife agency. If I buy a hunting license in Iowa or Colorado, that money goes to the state wildlife agency. It says to that state, if you use your hunting license or fishing license dollars, there's a companion act on the fishing side, but if you use those license dollars for anything else besides wildlife related stuff, we're going to take all of the federal funding away from you, right? And the federal funding is significant. Every year in Colorado, that amounted to about $13-14 million a year. Some years were higher and some years were lower, but every state gets an allocation of federal funding that they have to match it with a 25% match. But for every dollar, you get 3 federal dollars to do wildlife restoration work. So like I said, it's a I don't want to call it a double-edged sword. It's like a double-edged candy cane, right? There's sweet sides to both sides.
Yeah.
Because not only does it say that state money has to be used in that state in order to get these federal dollars that we're going to match you at $3 to 1. So it's, I think, one of the greatest reasons that wildlife restoration in North America has been able to proceed at the rate it has. It's a huge success story.
Yeah, it really is. So in 1937, was that basically the carrot to get state wildlife agencies to seriously invest time and resources into wildlife restoration and wildlife habitat management?
I think what it was, at least from my perspective, what it did more than anything was it professionalized the wildlife management field, right? It said it's an area of science, right? This is something that deserves some serious study, and we are going to commit, right? This is important. We're going to commit.
Yeah, that's really neat. So, what proportion in Colorado do you know of like the wildlife agency's budget does this kind of funding account for, like between license sales and PR and Dingo Johnson? Like, is it a big proportion of a state agency's budget or a small line item? How does it compare?
Yeah, and it varies across the United States, but in Colorado, the amount of funding from hunting and fishing license dollars and the federal dollars, the Pittman Robertson money, was the majority of our budget. I think it amounted to, over $70 million a year. Now, we do have some things in Colorado that have come on recently, lottery funding as an example, and some of those other things. But those federal dollars, license dollars, and a lot of that, thanks to non-resident hunters too, right? It's like this big community of hunters spending money across the United States, fund wildlife restoration, especially at a state level.
So when you said you wanted to visit 3 things on ways that wildlife or that hunting impacts wildlife habitat management, one of them was other organizations, and I think we maybe could check that one off. That was Ducks Unlimited PF. Yeah, you're giving me a thumbs up. So the other one was direct spending and direct impacts. I think we maybe got that one with the funding and
the license dollars? Yeah.
Okay, so the last one was indirect. Have we? What are the indirect impacts, do you think, of hunting on wildlife habitat and in the communities where this stuff is going on?
Okay, so what we talked about, right, is that hunting is a passion for a lot of people, and so they spend a lot of money on gear, but they also spend a lot of money improving their own private lands. They spend a lot of money that goes to organizations that fund conservation easements and things like that, that set those lands aside and help the private landowner who wants that family farm maybe to stay as a family farm, right? So that's coming back. The other thing that when you see those hunting license, or not the hunting license dollars, excuse me, but the indirect spending, that the money that hunters spend in a motel room in some little town in rural USA, that it turns over in that community and allows that community to stay a thriving rural community, as opposed to a ghost town where the kids have to move to a big city and all of that kind of stuff. So I think, which in turn affects the habitat, right? Because if people are staying on the land and caring for the land, that's better for all of us. It makes our water cleaner and our air purer and all of that kind of stuff.
When I talk about these kind of things to people, I like to list off popular places in hunting culture in North America. I grew up a duck hunter, crazy about duck hunting, and for us, like the mecca is Stuttgart, Arkansas. And it's always
I got in
fun.
trouble with you, remember, for going to Max Prairie Wings.
Yeah, we did get in trouble once in Arkansas because we spent way too much time at the outdoor store in Max Prairie Wings. I forgot about that. I did get you in trouble. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's always fun to ask and then ask people that don't duck hunt what these places are. What Can-Do, North Dakota, the duck hunting capital of the world. Huron, South Dakota, the pheasant hunting capital of the world. Stuttgart, Arkansas. I mean, although sure, it would never compete to with New York City or Denver or Santa Fe or any of these big American cities. It is the world to some communities, and managing wildlife populations and wildlife habitat in those landscapes is really important to the sustainability of those communities. I really like that message. So we wanted to ask about some more specifics on how the gun can actually impact, like directly impact habitat. A lot of the stuff that we talked about are kind of these indirect impacts, particularly in funding, which is a really important part of the picture. But we talked a little bit about deer in the East, overabundant deer, and their impacts on bird feeders and forests, among other things. But you mentioned snow geese. So would you want to walk us through that example, like the challenges that snow geese present and how hunting and hunters are managing wildlife habitat with snow geese?
Yeah, and snow geese are really interesting for a couple of reasons. One of the biggest ones is their population has increased like to incredible levels, and part of that due to how we've changed the landscape, just like it is for deer, right? We've created more edge. We've created refugia for these animals. Well, snow geese were a population we were trying to recover. We built refuges for them so they could migrate from their breeding habitats in the Arctic on down to the coast. And the other thing that we did is we planted grain and cereal crops along the way, right? So it used to be that they'd get to one place or the other and they would be fairly thin. Their survival would be lower, all of that kind of stuff. Well, populations started to take off. And on top of that, about the same time, we started to see decline in hunter numbers, which actually allowed those goose populations to kind of explode. And so now what we're doing is we're actually using hunters with a lot of relaxed seasons, like no limits. They can use electronic calls, which are not typically used. They maybe don't have to use plugged shotguns, as an example, to make that easier so that hunters can harvest more of those animals. And hunters aren't going to be 100% of that solution, but they can certainly help. And then, Adam, for folks that don't know and might be listening, the thing about snow geese is they dig in the mud, and they eat roots, and they pull plants out above ground. They actually go through and they graze, and they'll regraze, and so they can affect salt marshes and Arctic grassland, Arctic tundra habitat in a variety of ways. And getting back to Aldo Leopold's quote about deer, some of this habitat is not recovering, right? It doesn't recover in the time period the snow geese are gone. It may take decades to do it. And so it's one of those things that's a problem we need to be dealing with right now.
It's mind-bending to think about what happens in the temperate regions like Nebraska and South Dakota and North Dakota and down into Texas, where these geese spend their winters, is having impacts on plants and organisms in Arctic regions and high latitudes that many of us would never even lay our eyes on. So I think there's two threads there to connect. One is that the importance of that scientific management that you talked about, that some of these funding mechanisms and others enabled the development of in the 20th century to understand that science and be able to connect those what's going on in the Arctic to what's going on in Nebraska, say. And then the other one is the ability to understand how to impact populations through harvest, such as, like you said, putting the harvest closer to the breeding season. So managing overabundant species has me thinking the vast majority of species that we hunt and allow harvest on are not necessarily overabundant. So what's the justification or what's the rationale for still allowing for harvest of like declining populations like sage grouse, or in many parts of the east, northern bobwhites are declining? What's your thinking on that logic, and what's sort of the science on that as well?
The science behind that is I don't know of any populations that are being impacted by hunting. There may be some declining populations that are being hunted, but they're not having an impact on those populations. And that's all goes back to that scientific wildlife management, right? We're generally taking only a biological surplus, or if it's not a biological surplus, in the case of a declining population, is it might be that component of the population that was going to be met by some compensatory form of mortality because habitat is limited. In a lot of cases, the reason that these species are declining is because habitat is limited, and the one thing that I found, and it gets back to that sort of passionate piece, that advocacy piece, is that what I find about sage grouse hunters is they care more about the continued survival of sage grouse than anybody does, right? The diehard elk hunter cares more about the cow-calf ratios in their local elk herd than the state wildlife agency does. And I can tell you, as a former employee of a state wildlife agency, we would hear about it if the elk population wasn't doing real well, and we would hear it loudly, and that part of what hunting does and how it fits in, I think, is a critical tool. And another example, I'll just carry that a little bit further. I think about diseases, right? Like avian influenza or chronic wasting disease. Where does most of that information come from? It comes from hunter harvested animals. Band returns on waterfowl, right? Migratory birds. All of that information comes back from hunting, and without it, you're just not going to have that kind of data.
Yeah, and those impacts of not having those kind of data could ripple through the ecosystem. The chronic wasting disease one is, I bet we could have a whole episode on it. And how could a disease and its potential threats or uncertainty to hunters have impacts on habitat? Well, if all of a sudden hunters get disenfranchised or can't participate because of the prevalence of the disease and associated uncertainty or human risks, then that's going to have drastic changes on ecosystems that are going to ripple through and impact wood thrushes or impact sage thrashers or whatever species of wildlife you're managing, wherever it is that you have chronic wasting disease. So that's really, it's important to think about how all these threads are connected and how hunting does play an important role in all this. So the quote talks about the use of the gun. We've been talking mostly about hunting as well, but I want to kind of imagine another use that's important in wildlife habitat management. That's like kind of dealing with offending critters, like and in many cases we think of that being done primarily by trapping, but it could also be hunting. But we think of targeting a specific individual. So what's the role, or what's your thinking on sort of nuisance wildlife conflicts and the importance of having those skills and that ability available to people in managing wildlife habitat or managing natural areas?
Yeah, so sometimes we don't have too many of whatever it is, right? But we could have too many of whatever it is in the wrong place. And in some cases, it could just be that one animal that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it could be causing crop damage, um, damage to local infrastructure, a beaver backing up water that's going to flood out a road or somebody's basement is a pretty serious thing. And it's similar to the deer situation where a hunter who knows that animal can remove it humanely, can save the community a lot of money in terms of damage, but also in terms of just finding somebody that's able to go in there and get it done quickly. The other thing that it can do is a lot of times, and in Colorado, we'll occasionally have trouble with a small resident herd of elk that take up and they're damaging crops, or it might be a flock of geese that are damaging crops, or in an area where they're causing some sort of damage. And what happens with hunting activity is a hunter may go home with a goose or two for a few dinners and maybe some sausage and things like that. But the bottom line is you make those animals a little bit more wary of coming to that area. So you distribute them across the landscape in a different way where they don't have that level of impact. So oftentimes goes back to being the non-consumptive hunter, right? You don't have to kill a lot of animals to relieve a lot of damage.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about that. We think almost always of the impact of hunting being the animals that are removed, but in this way, you're saying hunting has impacted the animals that remain in a way that makes them better able to coexist or better lessen their impacts on wildlife habitat that's out there. So that's really cool. Thanks for sharing that example. So as we want to sort of wrap up, the last question that we've been asking in this podcast is to go back, or this series of podcasts here on the Leopold quote. To go back to the quote, he says, game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools that have heretofore destroyed it. And so what we wanted to ask in sort of wrapping this up is like, what do you think is maybe the most creative use of the gun that you've seen in your work, or even as a hunter yourself, since you've been hunting since you were 9? What do you think is the most creative impact of hunting or hunters on wildlife habitat and wildlife habitat management?
This may not be all that creative, but one of the things I think is interesting, or maybe it's an opportunity on and how we use the gun moving forward, is that people are really interested in feeding themselves organic, sustainable foods. And I think that's an opportunity we talked about community and how these community-based solutions and bringing more hunters in. And we also talked about how, part of the snow goose explosion was due to a decline in the number of people that were actually hunting snow geese. And so an opportunity to make sure that hunters are part of that habitat scenario moving forward, and make sure that all of us have healthy wildlife habitat so we can watch songbirds in eastern hardwood forests, and we have other birds in wetlands, that are dependent on duck hunters, is to think about how we engage new people into hunting as as a sustainable food source, right? As a locavore, how we're going to feed ourselves moving forward.
Yeah, you've kind of brought us full circle now in a couple of ways. One is just sort of your own personal connections and identity as a hunter, I think is a fun thing to explore. And then the other thing is how you started way back when you said, we got to all get along at the beginning of the podcast. We got to all get along, and we got to understand one another and work together. And I think that's kind of the lesson that I take from your example, is that we can apply lessons to understanding and engaging hunters and wildlife habitat management to understanding and engaging people from a bunch of different walks of life that are engaged and passionate about wildlife resource conservation.
And I think it's another opportunity to say, right, if we have healthy habitat, we know we have healthy wildlife population, but if we have healthy habitat, we'll also have healthy harvests, and we'll be able to feed our community and our families really high quality protein in a way that benefits the rest of the community.
And it benefits the land and all the wildlife that are dependent on it. And that seems like a win-win all the way around.
You bet.
I think that's a great place to leave this in reflecting on what got us here and those unregulated exploitation. We've certainly come a long way from understanding its detrimental impacts and how safe and judicious application of the gun can really be an important tool in wildlife habitat management. So Pat, thanks for joining us on the podcast and availing us to all your experiences and perspectives from a really cool career.
Well, thank you, Adam. And I'm enjoying Habitat University, so I hope you guys continue to do a few more of these.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.